This episode of Tools for the Future is all about sustainability, specifically the frameworks, tools, and principles that underlie sustainability and allow us to conceive of a more sustainable future. Really, there's nothing easy about sustainability. It can get very complex, and there isn't always a lot of agreement between experts, so the answers are not always clear about how to move forward or how to make better or more sustainable. For example, consider this very simple situation: paper bag or plastic bag, which is better for the environment? Most people are interested in making the right decision. They don't care what the answer is necessarily. They just want to be helped to make the right one when they have the choices put in front of them. Fortunately, there's no real good way to answer this question. There are lots of proponents of plastic bags because they weigh so much less than a paper bag, and therefore they save so much CO2 just being transported around compared to paper bags. And of course, there are a lot of proponents of paper bags claiming that it's a more natural ingredient because they don't require petroleum product, because they grow literally on trees, they're compostable, etc. The simple fact here is that there are benefits and problems with each of these choices, and even experts can't agree which would be best, because the issues, even with such a simple item made of one material with one part, the issues are still complex enough that there's no clear answer. It's important to maybe recognize that sometimes we don't even need a bag and we just use them out of convenience. This orange is already in a bag that protects itself. Or the answer might be to use reusable bags, which reframes the question in a new way. So if choices can be so difficult or complex with even such simple items, imagine what happens when the choices are much more complex. For instance, these two cars. Which one would be better for the environment? Now, back in 2004, a dust-to-dust or life cycle analysis study claimed that the Hummer H2 was better for the environment than the Toyota Prius. You can only imagine the outcry from Prius owners and other people who were interested in sustainability. But if we look at the details about how the study was done and the assumptions they were making, they were very clear and not particularly egregious assumptions made. The challenge with the Prius that most people don't realize is that they have two completely different drivetrains. They used a lot newer kinds of technology back in 2004, and those two drivetrains doubled the amount of parts within the engine and the drive components, therefore exponentiating the impact on the environment in terms of manufacture, or what we call the embodied energy. If we look at the comparison made in this study, the Prius clearly wins in terms of energy usage during its lifetime. However, the Hummer, even though it's a bigger car, outshone the Prius in terms of impact on manufacturing and impact on disposal. But if you look very closely, you'll notice that the assumptions made about the lifetime of these two products, they're very different. The Prius was assumed to last only 100,000 miles, and the Hummer between 200,000 and 300,000 miles, and therefore all of the embodied energy or all of the environmental impact was amortized for the Prius over half or less amount of miles, which sent the resulting benefits into the Hummer's favor. Now, just 4 years after that initial study, it was redone with new assumptions because there was new information known about how the Prius performed in the real world. At this point, they doubled the lifetime expectation of the Prius to 200,000 miles, and they also lowered the lifetime expectation of the Hummer to the same 200,000 miles, therefore equalizing the lifespan. In this case, the Prius then dropped below the Hummer substantially in terms of its impact on the environment. Now, many people attack this study as being biased against Toyotas or Priuses, or being biased in the favor of American cars or cars like the Hummer, etc. But it wasn't an unreasonable assumption that the Prius was originally held to a 100,000-mile lifespan, because that was the stated warranty for the batteries in the Prius. According to Toyota, they would last for 100,000 miles and they might need to be replaced after that, which was a huge expense and a huge environmental impact. But 4 years later, with some data about how these cars were both performing in the marketplace, that assumption was changed, and you can see that the pricing per mile or the dynamics of the environmental impact were completely changed as well. But before we start lavishing a bunch of praise on the Toyota Prius, recognize that because it has two completely different drivetrains and therefore that many more parts, even though it's a smaller car, In comparison to even other Toyotas that aren't hybrids, it was still more expensive. The Toyota Camry, for instance, in 2008 was more expensive in a bigger car with bigger functionality and still had a lesser environmental impact because it was a simpler car with much fewer parts. And of course, other Toyota cars like the Corolla at the same time had vastly less impact on the environment, even though they had very similar functions. And of course, if we compare them to much smaller cars that obviously have smaller functions, you can see the impact on the environment goes down sharply. So if it's not easy to make these comparisons unless you have the LCA data or unless you have some experience and understanding about the complexities involved, it's not easy as a consumer to make these kinds of choices when we buy things out in the marketplace. Now, here's another example. Which of these is better for the environment? A one-time use paper cup, a glass mug, or a ceramic mug? Which would be better? It turns out that we can't really have this conversation until we talk about how often each of these objects is used. We don't expect to use a paper cup more than once, but there's so much embodied energy that goes into firing a ceramic mug or a glass mug that their benefits, that is being able to be used more often and therefore amortize the costs of the embodied energy used to make them over more uses, doesn't really start showing up until about 36 uses. That means that if you're not going to use the glass 36 to 70 times, you're still better off probably using the paper cup one at a time as long as you're not doing it more than 35 times. At 71 uses and above, the ceramic mug even becomes better to own than the glass mug. But of course, none of this matters unless you're actually going to use these objects these many times. If they just sit on your shelf and never get used that much, then the embodied energy that went into creating them is never accounted for. Here's another example. It's common now to see compostable utensils in the marketplace, in cafeterias, etc., and compared to the more common plastic utensils, which is better for the environment? Now, most people would assume absolutely the compostable utensils are better for the environment. But the problem is if they're never composted, meaning they're never put into the composting stream, or if there's no composting stream to put them into anyway, then their benefits never get realized. In many communities, the composting stream doesn't allow for these compostable utensils to be used and therefore gum up the composting process, destroying the viability of the compost itself, and then all of that gets thrown in the landfill anyway. So if your community or your composting system isn't ready for these objects, it would be better in the long run to just use the plastic ones. This is because composting requires air, water, microbes, sunlight, heat to permeate the composting process in order for composting to take place. When these materials are put into landfill, for instance, and there is no permeability to any of these elements like sunlight, rain, groundwater, or microbes, landfills sit almost in stasis. You can go into many landfills from 70 years ago, dig into the middle, and pull out newspapers that look as fresh as the day that they were printed and delivered. So if none of these elements are getting into the composting system or the landfill, they simply just don't get composted. Next question. Is an object like this recyclable? Many people would jump to the conclusion and say, no, of course not. But the actual answer is yes, everything's recyclable. The issue isn't about recyclability as much as it is about economics. Sure, someone could pull apart these objects, separate them into their separate material parts, deconstruct everything, and then take the time to put them in the proper recycling streams for the materials that they are. The problem is that there's a very expensive, labor-intensive process that makes it so expensive to recycle that there's no value in doing so other than just the natural or the social value of having done the right thing. So while everything is theoretically recyclable, that's really not the measure that we need to be looking at. What we should be considering is how much recycled content actually gets reused in the production of new goods. Something being recyclable hypothetically doesn't have any benefit to the environment. Only the actual use of recycled products and materials has a benefit to the environment. Which of these are better for the environment, the Apple laptop or the HP laptop? Now, like with most of these questions, it's a little bit of a trick question. Turns out that both Apple and HP have completely different approaches to sustainability. That is to say, they have sustainability strategies that they adhere to, but they're very different. Apple's strategy is all based around dematerialization and getting every last milligram of materials out of the product that don't absolutely have to be there. HP has a related sustainability strategy in lightweighting, and so they choose to use materials like plastic because they're so much lighter than the aluminum that is standard in most Apple laptops. Now, we could have an argument about whether the HP strategy is better than the Apple strategy, and it turns out experts do this all the time. And like the paper bag example, there's not necessarily a clear winner. There are strengths and weaknesses of both strategies. The point of this question is not whether Apple's better than HP or whether a sustainability strategy is necessarily better than another. The point is that both have a sustainability strategy, whereas almost none of their competitors do. Where's Asus's or Lenovo's sustainability strategy? They simply don't exist. So we can make room for more than one sustainability strategy that different companies or communities might take. The point is that we should require companies and communities and other kinds of organizations to actually have a sustainability strategy, to think through these issues and come up with a reasonable, rational, strategic decision about how they're going to proceed. Often, in discussions about sustainability, nuclear power comes up as a solution to climate change, especially because climate change is rapidly growing to such a rate. Most of the proponents, however, of nuclear energy only look at a narrow piece of the life cycle of a nuclear power plant, and that is its use. Like in the Prius versus Hummer example, absolutely nuclear power plants in use have a dramatically lower impact on the environment than, let's say, a coal-fired power plant or other traditional kinds of power generation. However, if we look outside towards the entire life cycle of a nuclear power plant, we have clear questions, especially about the mining technique and their impact on not just the environment, but the communities downstream of the mining tailings, and there's a terrible history there, as well as the other end of the life cycle, which is the disposal, where we have tremendous amounts of spent nuclear fuel sitting in ponds without any clear strategy for how to deal with them in a sustainable way. There are pros and cons of nuclear power, but many of the ecological and social impacts are just never tabulated as part of the discussion. So, what exactly is sustainability? And can we come to some clear agreements or understandings about what it means given the complexities we just saw in these examples? Here's a very common or traditional definition of sustainability that came from the Brundtland Commission back in 1987. It's understandable, it's fairly clear, but it doesn't help everyone make decisions when they encounter choices of their daily lives or when they're making choices in their business lives. Here's a much simpler definition of sustainability. Don't do things today that make tomorrow worse. With this kind of definition, most people wouldn't disagree with this. They may disagree about how to go about it or what priorities they have, but most people in the world aren't trying to make the world worse. Now, given the kind of age of decision makers, for instance, if you're talking to business leaders of a certain age, sometimes personalizing this by tacking on a statement like "for your kids" helps these leaders understand the importance of sustainability and better ecological and social impacts. For even older decision makers, for instance, people of the age that they might be sitting on a board of directors, it may be their grandkids that they need to keep in mind when making decisions that might impact their future. I know this looks a little bit trite, but the sustainability world is full of stories of decision makers and business leaders that only came to understand the importance, the need, and the imperatives of sustainability when they're thinking about the future that they're leaving for their grandkids. So this is actually a very practical approach to starting a discussion about sustainability. At its highest level, sustainability covers three categories. The financial system, which sits in a larger social system, which sits in a larger ecological system, or nature. Everything about sustainability, whether it's social issues or ecological issues, fits into these three categories. And they're nested such that the financial system wouldn't exist if not for the support of the social systems around it. And the social systems, meaning society, would not exist were it not for the support that nature gives it. So there's a hierarchy of importance here. Now, we can fine-tune some of these categories and call out parts of these categories. For instance, in the social category, we often differentiate cultural sustainability or community sustainability and issues, and that's perfectly fine. But they still fit within these three larger categories. When we talk to business leaders or when we talk in a business context, simply changing the vocabulary and the words we use can reframe the importance and an understanding of what these issues are. So, for instance, capital is the word that most business people use to talk about money or the financial system, which is fine. But in the last 30 years, sustainability proponents have learned to use that word capital in order to bring a new imperative to the other impacts that we should be talking about. Natural capital is the term they use to talk about nature's benefits to the world. And then, of course, things like human or social or cultural capital are an attempt to help business-minded people understand the value of these things in our environment and in our society. What it really comes down to is these simple concepts: nature and its health and its ability to support us, society and the impacts that influence fairness and justice, money and equity around the financial systems, and then you and your personal sustainability sitting within all of these. Now, there are several sustainability principles that I won't go into detail, but you can certainly find detail about these things, especially in texts about systems thinking. A really good text for this would be Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. When we talk about the principles of sustainability, it talks about the movement of materials, energy, components, and one of the ways we talk about that is parts and wholes, which is to say, in a complex system made up of lots of parts, we also have to look at the larger context or the whole that those parts function in order to understand how a system works. We also have the concept of stocks and flows, which is materials move and pool in different places and then flow into other places. You can think of water as a good example of this. Rain rains on mountains and pools in lakes and then runs down rivers, for instance. And if we think about materials moving in these stocks and flows, it gets us an understanding of their value at any given state. I'm not going to talk a lot about either parts and wholes or stocks and flows because most people really don't need to understand on a deep level how these things work. Instead, it's much more important to understand a concept like diversity being the foundation of resilience. So if a new pest, for instance, attacks a cherry crop, the diversity in different kind of cherries around the world and their different resistances to that pest becomes really critical. Systems become more resilient when there is diversity within them, even if that diversity has a slightly worse impact on efficiency, for instance. Similarly, the concept of decentralization has been talked about in the business world for 40 or 50 years, and there are definitely strengths to taking a decentralized model to a system. So there are definitely strengths to decentralization, but not everything is better when it's decentralized. There are also benefits to centralization. So we have to find balance between these competing forces, even if one is favored or another in current business discussions. Similarly, we hear a great deal about the value of competition, especially from the business world, but competition has to be in balance with forces of cooperation. In fact, competition really can't occur without cooperation on lower levels that enable that kind of competition. A great example of this is all the variety of electrical plugs and voltages around the world. Consider how difficult it would be to create complex electrical devices without standardization across a large region. Even today, moving between North America and Asia or the EU or Africa requires people to bring both physical and voltage adapters in order for the equipment to work. if there wasn't even this level of cooperation on electrical systems and plugs, and instead there were hundreds of different standards, we wouldn't even be able to build complex devices like coffee makers and laptops and move them around the world, because the variety needed in order to create a scaled device would be economically impossible. The cooperation on a low level of, in this case, voltage and plug standards actually enables the variety that we see in the kinds of electrical devices that get made and produced. So competition and cooperation need to be seen as two sides of a balanced system, not promote one or the other as the answer to everything. Now let's talk a little bit about the frameworks that have been developed to help us think about sustainability. And there are a lot of them. Some of these frameworks emphasize or enable the measurement or the decision-making around ecological sustainability, some around social or financial sustainability, others still around issues of cultural sustainability. There are lots of frameworks and tools that have been developed over the last 60 years, and not everyone needs to know all of them. In fact, most people don't need to know any of them. However, if you work for a company or an organization or a government that has decided to use one of these frameworks, perhaps the natural step, obviously you need to become familiar with those in order to do the kinds of work or analysis that you're seeking to do. Only a few of these necessarily have widespread appeal or application to many industries and contexts. Here are some of the tools, for instance, that help us think and act more sustainably. The first tool I'll talk about is life cycle analysis, or LCA, also known as life cycle assessment in some worlds. LCAs are the chief ecological measurement tool that allows us to answer a question as simply as, is this product better than this product for the environment? To do a full LCA requires us to look at all of the inputs and outputs, so in this case, emissions, minerals, water, energy, etc., and to look at them over the entire life cycle of the product, meaning the mining of the materials and the gathering of the components, the manufacturing process, the use process, and then the disposal process, if there is one, and the recycled loops that happen within industry in order to reclaim water, materials, air, energy, etc. To perform an LCA can be incredibly complex, especially if it's a complex device. It can be time-consuming, and therefore it can be expensive. Most of the time, engineers within organizations are the ones performing these LCAs, but there are LCA tools out there that have been designed to be usable by more people. Designers, for instance, have access to these kinds of tools while they're making their design decisions, which is incredibly important because it's not enough to do the LCA after you've developed and produced the product. That can certainly give you insights into the next thing that you make. But we have to address these issues on the front end of the development process so that we can make the changes in time to have better impacts. It's also important, like with the nuclear energy example, to be considering the entire life cycle of the thing that you're analyzing, or else you're not getting a really clear picture of what the ecological costs really are. A product like Sustainable Minds is a good product for designers or even lay people to use to explore the impacts of different parts and different materials and different approaches to the design of any given object. Another popular tool for designers and engineers is the concept of biomimicry. And this is a development process that helps us step through development in a way that considers the kinds of solutions that are already present in nature. If we can distill our goals with a product and translate those into biological terms and then go out into nature and look for examples about how nature solved a very similar problem, and then look at the solution and see if we can emulate nature's strategies and then pull them back and reevaluate the things that we're developing with those understandings, very often we can come to much better solutions that work and make use of the learnings that nature can teach us. This process, this biomimicry process, doesn't eliminate or substitute a normal design and development process, but it can easily fit into the design and prototyping and testing portion of a design process. One of the reasons for this is that nature doesn't care about social issues. Nature doesn't share our social values. And so the biomimicry process only really looks at materials and form and other issues of ecological input. And there isn't a place within biomimicry to consider social input and impacts. So in order to use the biomimicry process effectively, we still have to do the kinds of considerations in the design process that are required before we engage biomimicry as a way of learning from nature on the impacts that our design and development decisions might have on the final solution. An increasingly popular framework to think about sustainability is the idea of the circular economy. And this is the famous butterfly diagram created by Ellen MacArthur and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that describes a very simple but powerful concept, which is nature has no waste. Everything that is the waste of one process in nature becomes the food or fuel or impact of another process. And if we could think of our man-made creations similarly, we could make things that didn't have waste, or the waste of a product or service became the food or input for a different product and service. So in order to enable this, we need to think about separating biological materials from technical materials. Think of things that might be grown in a garden versus things that might be created in a factory, especially of technical materials like metals and plastics. When we put these two kinds of products together in a way that can't be separated, we create something called a monstrous hybrid, which means that if they're not easily separated, they can't go back into these other cycles, the biological materials to be composted with like materials, or the technical materials to be recycled with their similar processes. Instead, that monstrous hybrid, that conjoined set of materials, can only be thrown out as waste in a landfill, for instance, because there's no way to reclaim the value that went into either component if you can't separate them. So when we look to using a circular economy approach to design and development, we need to think about how to keep and enable the easy transference of these materials, either in use or in disposal, within their own systems, recycling systems and composting systems. This is a really powerful approach that we've barely even begun to capture the value of. However, there are two things that are missing from this approach. That is, we should account also for the social impacts and values and the economic values and add them into the same decision making. This is the way to solve the problem, for instance, of product like the one we saw before with the hoverboard being technically recyclable, but never being recycled because the economic incentives or the social incentives aren't there to do so. So an expanded butterfly diagram would include how to handle decisions for all four of these cycles, not just for the biological and technical materials within the development process. Ideally, there's another concept that's been talked about for decades, and that is the idea of true cost accounting. If the social and financial and ecological costs of everything that we dealt with were already baked into the components, the materials, the development processes, so that when we saw a product available on the shelf or a service that we were using, the costs of these factors and impacts were already accounted for, it would absolutely enable us to make much better choices about which products to buy and which services to use. Someday this might be available. There are certainly people working on the systems that must underlie this in order to enable it. It's far away. We're nowhere close right now to true cost accounting, even though it is the ideal solution that fixes most of this. Another tool that enables the conversations about these issues, especially on the social side, are things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of which there are currently 17. Although there are movements to simplify that down into fewer. Each of these is a concept and an imperative approaches the description of either an ecological impact or a social impact that we desperately need to address and solve within the world. This makes it easy to start a conversation about these issues anywhere around the world, because there are materials describing these issues and their imperatives that we can use to discuss our role in their impact. Another tool that's been talked about for a long time is called the triple bottom line. This has probably been 2 or 3 decades of conversation in the business world, especially in the sustainable business world, about how to better account for ecological and social costs of doing business, not just the financial costs. Most companies around the world, most governments around the world use and require a fairly detailed accounting constantly of financial costs of assets and liabilities, of revenue and expenses. And if we could bring the same kind of resolution and detail to the ecological and social impacts, then we could track our decisions and our progress in a company or in an NGO or a government across all 3 areas. The problem that arises, of course, is that in tough economic times like a recession, it's too easy for business leaders or government leaders to just simply ignore the other 2 columns and go back to just focusing on the financial costs, with the assumption that we don't have time or we cannot afford to think about the social and ecological impacts. We just need to talk about and think about and act on the financial impacts. So having these things separate but alongside makes it easy for business leaders and others to ignore these other impacts and go on just like we've done for 100 years. Instead, a different approach is something called the integrated bottom line. This was proposed by students at the Presidio Graduate School, and it recognizes that the costs and benefits of all of these social and ecological issues actually are interleaved with financial benefits and costs in a business or any kind of organization. For instance, if you can attract better workers or keep the workers that you have now longer because of your social impacts or programs and because of your ecological importance, that has a very real economic impact and benefit on your HR function. You don't have as much churn in employees because they stay more easily and longer, and that reduces your HR costs. So all of these decisions aren't done separately with separate impacts. They all affect each other, and the idea of the integrated bottom line is to show that interconnectedness so that business leaders and organizational leaders could make better, more sustainable decisions. The problem here is that we don't have these processes built. And even if a company decided tomorrow to institute triple bottom line, let alone an integrated bottom line, there's no practical way for them to do so, unfortunately. So this is another tool that is great in theory, but isn't close to being something that someone could use. On the social side, one of the most popular tools right now to assess social impact is a process called theory of change, and it comes from the nonprofit world. Here, there's a requirement to discuss what the problem is and who the audience is that you're targeting for this change or these new opportunities, and what the actions are that create new impacts, and then how to measure them and how to define that as benefit. The idea here is it's not enough to say that you're going to do good things in the world. You have to show in a reasonable way the assumptions that you're making and the expectations you have of your activities that will have those benefits in order for someone to assess whether they want to invest in this kind of approach or this kind of organization. So the NGO world, in order to give out grants, more and more relies on people to report their theory of change so that they can start a dialogue about how they're going to have impact and how they're going to measure it later in order to convince people that their approach is going to be fruitful. One easy tool that you might use is a sustainability scorecard. Here is mine that I developed for the Design MBA program when I ran it. And it's a evolution of one that Gabi Brink and Phil Hamlet built for the American Association of Graphic Artists. Here in one page is a short list of all of the most important impacts and processes with a short description as a reminder of what they mean, and a simple 5-number scoring system that quickly allows us to evaluate how sustainable our actions currently are and give us context about how far we still could go. You can download that off my website at nathan.com/tools. The last tool that I'll talk about before ending this video is a new one that's currently in development called the Ecological Benefits Framework and the marketplace that's created from these. In this framework, there are 6 components that seek to cover all of the social and ecological impacts and benefits of an activity. Those include soil, carbon or carbon dioxide, water and air quality, biodiversity, and then all the social issues which they've boiled down to the concept of equity. So anytime we try to build a new solution to have impact on the world, or anytime that we're investing in them, we need to measure across all 6 of these categories to really understand what the impacts could be. And it's okay to have benefits in some of the categories, but it's important to know that even though there might be benefit in some categories, we need to know if there are detrimental impacts in other categories. You can find out more information about this at ebfcommons.org. And moving forward, we're looking for the development in detail of the assessment metrics for these things to grow so that this can become a viable, wide-scale assessment tool across all of these categories of development. This is a good place to stop. We've talked about some of the principles and some of the frameworks and some of the tools that you might use to make more sustainable products and services in your professional life and make more sustainable choices about the things that you buy and use in your personal life. Thank you for watching, and you'll find other discussions of sustainability strategies and value and other aspects of how we make a more sustainable world within this same collection of Tools for the Future videos. Thank you.